Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number probably 14 of the World of Presentation podcast brought to you by us at 356 Labs. My name is Boris. I'm the founder of the company, but I'm not important at all during this podcast because today I have as a guest somebody who completely changed the way I and our whole team here at 356 Labs thinks about story and storytelling. Today, here with us in this episode is Mr. Kendall Haven, who is author of many books, I would say, but one of them for sure is way more interesting, or at least it was way more interesting to me, which was the so-called story proof book. I cannot say anything else but welcome you to the podcast. So I really don't know where to start from, but first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I was waiting for this for a long time. We also talked with you because you are going to join Present to Succeed, the conference in April. You will have a session there talking about storytelling, etc. But you also deliver a 4-hour workshop that's already almost sold out. Now, I want to kind of probably start from a lot of people use the word storytelling, but are they using it correctly? What do they mean? What are you seeing there?
Let me change the word correctly to constructively.
Okay.
People have used the word story and storytelling for millennia.
Okay.
First, take the word storytelling.
Okay.
There are two halves to that word. Story is a noun. Story is a thing. It's a physical asset. Companies should treat the word story like they treat any other valuable asset. You can hoard it, save it, sell it, rent it, invest in it. It is an incredibly effective stories are an incredibly valuable company asset.
Okay.
Telling is a verb. It's an interactive process. Many people think, well, if I put it on a video or if I write it in an article, no, it's not really interactive. It never changes. But what does change is each individual's experience of receiving the story. So that the process of conveying a story, that is to say, the telling part, is always an instantaneous, interactive process.
Okay.
The two are totally separate. The concerns, the issues, the variables that you control when you're developing story are different than those that you use and are concerned with when you work on the telling side. They're both important, but they are separate. Now, when we use the word story, most people think of things that begin with once upon a time, or things that are childish or for children.
Yeah.
People often think of story as being fiction.
Okay.
None of those are true. People have been trying to define story, those who write stories for thousands of years. What occurred to me and what I was able to research was not trying to define story by looking at stories.
Yeah.
But define story by what happens inside the mind of the person who receives the story.
Yeah.
If you're trying to tell a story, especially for a purpose, part of either internal or external for your company, you always have a purpose. There's something you're trying to do. You're trying to exert influence. You're trying to change someone's behavior, change their attitudes, beliefs, their values. And all that matters to accomplish that is what happens inside the head of the person who receives the story.
Yeah.
So we started to research story, not by looking at stories, but by looking inside the mind and brain of the receiver.
So how did you do that? Because in Storyproof, you write, like I missed to say, probably had to say that Story Proof is probably the only book on the topic that is more or less, and correct me if I'm wrong here, more or less 100% based on research.
Yes, I
More or
agree with.
less.
Well, there's one other book, and that's the follow-on book to Story Proof that I wrote in about 5 years later. After Story Proof came out,
Yeah.
that laid the basis. What that established is I gathered together research from 16 different fields of science and said, is there any evidence that we already have that says the human brain is hardwired to make sense of incoming information in story terms?
Yeah.
What we're able to say is, yeah, your brain is hardwired to it. Now, what that actually means is that before information actually ever gets to your conscious mind, before you're consciously aware of it, at a subconscious level, as part of initially making sense of that information, you have already shifted it into story form.
Yeah.
The form and structure of story lie between your conscious mind and the outside world. So that also means that the conscious mind and memory of every person you're trying to affect, you're trying to reach, their conscious mind and memory lie beyond story structure. Between their sensory organs, eyes and ears, and their conscious mind lie that initial processing that, among other things, converts that information into story terms, makes sense of it in story terms. So once we were able to establish that, that then made me able to get some research dollars to go into EEG and fMRI labs, wire up audiences so we could literally watch their brains and start to see how we go about processing incoming information.
Yeah.
And
that's the
how we make
part.
sense out of it, and then start to isolate what are the specific informational elements that control that process. And that then told us what were these essential elements that need to go into the information. They all are elements of story. So it's what information your target audience is going to use to make sense of what you provide. Now, what we find is if you don't actually overtly provide that information, your audience will always make it up. Now, make it up is a harsh term. They'll infer it, they'll imply it, they'll take what they already know, their past experiences, and suggest what would fill in those missing gaps. Here's what we find when we research it: when people have to infer missing information, particularly things like what someone is after, a goal, why that goal is important to them, motive, they tend to automatically infer goals and motives that are far more self-serving, far more narcissistic than actually is the case. Why should you care? Because we find that in all cultures where being narcissistic and totally self-absorbed are negatives, as soon as your audience, only because you didn't tell them exactly what the goals and motives were of, say, a division in your company or a new policy, they infer these ones that are much more negative, and therefore associate that negativity with the source of the information, and so turn against you and against the company and against the new policies. So we find that ignoring or not being consciously aware of these elements winds up being a very significant block to effective communication.
So I think that from those 2 or 3 or more sentences that you mentioned, we can fill in the whole episode, because I map everything that you are saying based on the book right now. So let me quickly go back, saying what you said about what people define or think about as story. In the book, you give examples of what people define as story or think a story is. and what you defined, because you coined more or less a definition of story. So can we go back to this comparison, what people believe story is and what it turns out to be, and then let's define those components that you mentioned, because you mentioned two of them already.
Yeah.
Back on the definition.
Well, when most people think of story,
Yeah.
I've done a lot of work in schools with parents and with teachers. And when they're coaching children to work on a story, the most common question that they ask of the child is, okay, what happens next?
Okay.
That's an event-based question.
Okay.
It's asking for what happens next. It is the surest way to coach someone to create a boring, ineffective story that exists. The myth is that stories are about what happens. They are not. Stories are about characters.
Okay.
Fiction stories, nonfiction stories, all stories are about characters.
Yeah.
For the target audience. What does the target
Important.
audience care about? They care about the characters, what they were after, why they were after it, and then they want to know, how does that character have to struggle in order to reach that goal? And then they want to know, do they get it or don't they get it?
Yeah.
So the myths about stories being fiction, well, there are many fiction stories. There are many stories that are dead on true. I've written 14 books now, collections of historical stories that I've researched and written that are all factually true. Most of the stories that people tell to their friends and family are, in fact, factually true stories. And yet we think about stories as something that you do when you're trying to spin an event. We tend to think about stories as the myths. One of the big myths about story, actually, as best I can historically track it, started in England.
Okay.
We tend to make sense of things by setting up paradigms of diametrically opposed elements, black and white, hot and cold. Once we establish those two, then you can fill in between. And you can fill in you can even fill in beyond hot and say scalding. You can fill in beyond cold and say freezing. And it makes sense because we have those two anchor points.
Yeah.
Opposite anchor points. At sometime shortly after the Renaissance in England, there was an effort made to define story by setting up that kind of a paradigm.
Okay.
Will you tell me what's the opposite of story?
Someone would probably say a fact or something like this.
Facts are in
or a non-story.
Yeah, we don't have the English language. Actually, there isn't a language on earth. I can't verify that because there are a number of languages I don't know. But of the major languages on earth, there isn't one that includes a word for non-story.
Yeah.
And so what happened in England, and I don't think it was a conscious effort, it apparently just happened over time, was that story started to get paired with other paradigms that it could set up: truth versus fiction, fact versus lie. And for whatever reason, story began to be associated with fiction and with lies. I've tried to work with children who told me that they weren't allowed to make up, their father said they weren't allowed to make up stories. Well, what the father meant was, you're not allowed, you're not allowed to lie. But what the words that came out of the father's mouth were, you are not allowed to tell stories. So in most of the Western cultures, those myths persist at a subconscious, culture-wide level, and they distort the value, our recognition of the value of story, because we miss the incredible power that stories can exert and actually do exert. So what is a story? What is a story? Let me add in a word to the definition: an effective story.
Okay.
All right. An effective story is one that's character-based.
Yeah.
It is a character-based presentation of a character's struggles to reach a goal that's important to them by trying in those struggles to overcome problems and conflicts that create significant risk and danger for the character, all
Yeah.
presented in sufficient sensory detail so that the receiver can visualize the events and the characters in their minds.
Yeah, that one is when I read this, I don't know whether or not it was exactly in the book in this exact words, but it was very close,
Very
like
close.
very close. Yeah, very close. When I read this, I more or less freezed and stopped and I was like, wait a minute. Now, wait a minute. Let me read that again to myself. Let me think about this. Let me kind of internalize what I just read, because when you read such a definition, you then say, wait a minute, obviously we are going to kind of cover the components that you mentioned, but then you kind of ask yourself, wait a minute, when we were building those stories or when we were telling those stories for our customers, did we actually, do we match that definition? Do we, like, is our thing that we built actually based on that? Because that was the moment when I was like, wow, I have never ever heard anybody define it. I believe you also gave some examples of how other people define it, but that definition is
Yeah.
like so complete by its nature, because you include all of the components in it, that it makes it so easy, I believe, for everybody, if they just stop and think about it and they say, wait a minute, is there a character in my story? Yes or no? Right? From there, do I describe the sensory details? Yes or no? So that people can picture that in their heads, right?
Do
So
I
what are, yeah,
do we include the struggles? So many
are there
companies
struggles at
are
all?
afraid. There always are. There always are. I work with companies a lot who say, no, we don't want to talk about the
Exactly,
struggle.
exactly. Same with our
We just
customers.
want to say, well, we had this, all's going good, and we succeeded. And the question is
Yeah,
then, well, then why did you have to spend $10 million and hire 1,000 people to do it? If it was that easy. So it's that easy,
yeah,
why didn't you do it on your own over a weekend? Well, the answer is that every company, every organization struggles mightily all the time. What
yeah,
they don't get is that in order to make your audience empathize with, that is to say, root for, and begin to identify with, and adopt the viewpoint of the company,
yeah,
they need to see and appreciate the struggles.
yeah,
Without the struggles, it all sounds like you're bragging,
yeah,
and they'll
yeah,
turn against
exactly.
you every time.
Yeah,
Uh, we can go a little bit further even and say it's not just characters. If we're talking about stories that will be effective, it's
yeah,
characters that you make relevant to and of interest to your target audience.
yeah,
So you got to think about what is it that makes a character, be it the CEO of a company, be it just a client, of someone who receives the services of the company, um, be it any kind of a character named or left anonymous.
okay.
What is going to make that character be of interest to and relevant to your target audience so that they will be engaged by the story? If they're not engaged by the story, they will not be influenced by it. And then you've just wasted your time by sharing the story.
Yeah. So let's go through the components, because you kind of mentioned a few of them at the beginning. Now, through the definition, what I did, by the way, back then
Yeah.
was, when I saw the definition in the book itself, I came up with, and I took a color marker, and started underlining and coloring each of the words that made an impression on me: character, goal, motive, goes through obstacles to achieve an important goal. And I was like marking the word sounds like, that's very interesting. And then I saw the components. So what are those components that are part of the definition? Let's define them in a quick way.
There are really 8 of them.
Okay.
And here's the good news. Every human being,
Yeah.
by the time they are 2, certainly
Okay.
2.5, have already at an automatic subconscious process learned that these elements build to stories that work,
Yeah.
that
And
get
you
them
have,
what they want. So
yeah,
that none of these, this isn't something like learning astrophysics where you have to go to school and learn things that you've never heard of before.
yeah,
These are all there inside your mind, but not part of your conscious mind. Your conscious mind is not the only processor in your brain. In fact, it's the slowest processor in your brain.
okay.
So anything that you can shove out of your conscious mind and handle with the subconscious processor, you do. Why? Much more efficient. Think of heart rate. They're controlling all of the functions of your body. You don't stop and think about those things. If you had to, you'd die because you'd never get it all done. They're all handled by subconscious processors. It's like tying shoelaces.
Yeah.
I'll guarantee you can tie a pair of shoelaces. I will also guarantee you could not right now write down in temporal sequential order what you do with each thumb and finger when you tie your shoelaces.
Yeah.
You can do it, but you couldn't sit down and tell me how you do it because you no longer handle that function in your conscious mind.
Yeah.
That's same thing has happened to your ability to tell stories. You can all do it, but you don't house that information in your conscious mind. So consciously, when you stop to think about it, you say, well, I don't know. Learning to be a consistently effective storyteller is mostly about learning to dredge information out of your subconscious mind up to your conscious mind. You're looking for information that's already there. So the elements again. Characters. Stories are all about characters. Well, what's a character? A character doesn't have to be a human being, but it is something that can express itself, that has some kind of will, and has, at least in its own mind, the ability to exercise that will. So a teacup, as long as it's a thinking, talking teacup, can be a character in a story. What we find when we're looking at the way that the brain creates meaning from stories and makes sense out of stories is that there are certain character positions that you expect to find. In fact, that you insist that you find. Again, this is all at a subconscious level. One of the course is the main character. That's who the story is about. The main character actually is that character whose goal is resolved at the end of the story.
By the way, can I stop you here?
Sure.
Can we think of the main character sometimes in the context of the world of presentations as the audience themselves?
You can do a story. Yes, you can. You can to do that, you have a couple of options. One is to talk the presentation in second person. So you're talking to the audience.
Yes,
exactly.
Do that.
That's a very risky way to do it because as soon as you say, you walk down the hallway and you open the door to your office and someone says, no, I don't. As soon as they say, no, I don't once, they're gone. And it's very difficult then to pick them back up. But yes, you can do it. The other way is if you know that part, let's say that part of your audience, a specific target audience that's there that maybe are heads of HR. Okay, let's just say that, and you really want to do this to heads of HR. And then, there are other people in the audience, but those are the guys you really want to reach. So if you then do a story about an example person who's in HR, real or a composite, say, person, in their minds, they're going to do the story about themselves so that the story in their minds will be about themselves, even if you, the presenter, aren't saying you know, John Schlabognik, the head of HR for XYZ company.
Exactly. Yeah.
In their minds, they'll do that so that
Yes.
it becomes for them a first person story. So
yeah, it is possible.
Main character generally then, you know, it's possible to do all sorts of bizarre things. People who write novels for a living love to do convoluted things. Have the main character also be the bad guy in the story, the antagonist.
Okay, yeah.
You can do that. You can have a number of different combinations. So main character, that's who the story's really going to be about. That's whose goal we care about. We'll talk about goal and moment, and goal and motive we care about. The next one is the antagonist. Antagonist doesn't have to be even, it doesn't have to be a human being. It doesn't even have to be a character.
Yeah.
The antagonist is really the embodiment of the biggest single obstacle that blocks character from reaching goal in this story. So you can have a whole lot of obstacles that someone has to overcome, but in this story that we're going to tell, you're going to pick one that becomes the antagonist. So you can have stories where social injustice, prejudice, the coronavirus, a mountain, a storm could be the antagonist. To make it a really effective antagonist, we have to treat that antagonist as if it were a sentient being that was out to block the main character from reaching the goal.
Yeah.
Okay, that's two. There's one other physical character position that we really care about, as it turns out, that no one had talked about until we identified this in the lab, the need for this character position. Let's call it the climax character.
Okay.
The question is, when it comes right down to it, who has the power in this story to make the story come out the way they want it to?
Yeah.
That may be the main character. It may not.
Yeah.
But someone has the power to make it come out. And what we find is that audiences would hold the person that they thought, the character they thought was the climax character, responsible if the story didn't come out right, not necessarily the antagonist. So main character, let's say a company is struggling to create a virus for the coronavirus. I mean, a vaccine for the coronavirus.
Yeah.
All right. And we're going through all the struggles. And there's another company that's also trying to create a vaccine who sneaks in and sabotages the work of our company. You think, oh, that's the antagonist. How cruel. At the end of the story, though, audiences hold responsible the janitor for our company because he knew about it and didn't do anything. And he was the only one who knew about it and didn't do anything. And suddenly the audience is totally upset with the janitor because he knew and he didn't do anything. He could have stopped it all. So there's this character that we think had the power to make the story come out right. They can exercise it or not exercise it, but it's a very important position because the climax character is the one who's responsible to act. And then the question is, one other question is, who will my target audience identify with? Who will they care about most in the story? It's really bad if your target audience cares about some side character in the story who has nothing to do with the message that you want to get across.
Yeah.
So we have those 4 character positions that are all characters, and we use the second of the 8 elements, the character traits, or just information about the characters, to induce our target audience to look at the characters in the story the way we want them to, and in their minds assign the story characters into those character positions as we would like them to. In other words, They're going to do it. They're going to do it. They're going to say, oh, I think this is the main character. Oh, this is the character I care about. Here's the character I think has the power and responsible. Here's the antagonist. But we want to control the way they do that so they'll look at the story the way we want them to. So we're talking about using story science to design and construct stories that will induce our target audiences to react to the stories the way we want them to.
Yeah,
so
because it's
that
not
character
guaranteed.
trait. What's a goal?
Yeah.
A goal, happiness is a terrible goal.
Okay.
World peace is a terrible goal. You know why? No one knows what they look like, really.
Okay.
To be an effective goal, it has to be something that is real and tangible so that everyone can visualize it.
Okay.
If you've ever read the Lord of the Rings, you know, that series of books.
Watch the movies only.
Okay, movies, same thing. It's about ultimate good and ultimate evil. The seemingly powerless ultimate good, the little hobbits, and the ultimate evil, this wicked, all-powerful Lord. But because those are such amorphous, hard to define entities, what the story is about is throwing this little ring, this magical ring, into the fiery pits of Mount Doom in the middle of the land of Mordor. He, the author, in order to talk about ultimate good and ultimate evil, created a goal that's a physical thing. At any moment in that book, you can think, who has the ring and how close are they to Mount Doom in the middle of the land of Mordor, and what still stands between them? So a goal to be effective has to be something every person can visualize, can see in their minds, and we'll all do the same thing. Tangible, real. Motive.
Clear.
Motive. This is one of the ones that is so consistently and grossly underrated. Oh my goodness. Motive is the information that explains why a goal is important.
Yeah.
This is where values, beliefs, attitudes, cultural norms, my wants, desires, problems all come in. They come in as motives, drivers. What we found in the lab was that if I want someone to identify with if I want my target audience to identify with a character in a story, the single element that will make that happen best is motive. It's called motive matching.
Okay.
If I show you that the motives of my character, the beliefs, attitudes, drivers, what they believe in, what they feel, what their value, if it's the same as yours, you'll identify with that character every time. And without even knowing it, you'll start to adopt their attitudes, their viewpoints, their beliefs as expressed in the story.
Yeah.
It's incredibly powerful. It is the way that you get your target audiences to start to think and act the way you want them to, is by inducing some motive match with the story character. So motives, one of those things that most companies forget to mention when they're working on their stories. They might say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we want to do. But they don't really talk about what's underneath and behind it in terms that will induce their target audience to buy in to the whole action, to the goal and to the actions to get there. So goal and motive.
Yeah.
Then we have to know, well, why hasn't the character already achieved their goal?
Yep.
There has to be something that stands between them and their goal. Problems and conflicts. General term, obstacles. A conflict is something that involves direct opposition to some other entity in the story. A problem is something like, I want to go to the store and the store is 2 blocks away. Well, 2 blocks away, technically, is a problem. Why? Because in this moment, it's keeping me from being at the store. Okay.
Yep.
Problems can be simple. They can be incredibly complex and almost impossible to overcome. We, generally speaking, are more engaged by, or more easily engaged by, conflicts than by problems. It's not a sure thing. The reason is that conflicts more easily create what creates excitement, what controls tension in the story. And as the saying is, as goes tension, so goes attention.
Yeah, that one is a big one. As goes tension,
So goes
so goes
attention.
attention. That is a big
Yeah.
one.
And so there is always tension in a story. There has to be something. We have to be worried about, oh, what's going to happen, or how are they going to get that? How are they going to get that? There has to be some story question that is on our minds that creates some attention in order to hold our attention and keep us engaged. The thing that does that is risk and danger.
Mm.
Two separate, very tightly related elements. Risk is the likelihood that something's going to go wrong, the probability of failure. Danger is what happens to a character if something goes wrong. It's the consequences of failure.
Mm.
At every moment, we as human beings are taught almost from birth to be aware of risk and danger. You stand on a street corner, you look both ways. Why? You want to reduce the risk of getting flattened by a huge delivery truck that's zipping down the road at 80 kilometers an hour, right?
Yeah.
If you see one, you think, the likelihood of me getting flattened here and dying on the street is pretty high, so I'll wait on the curb.
Yeah.
It doesn't change the danger, it reduces the risk. What we find is that mathematically,
yeah,
and I won't go into math a lot as we talk today, but this is one that just blew my mind. If you put risk and danger on scales of 0 to 1, moment to moment, and calculate them and multiply them together, risk times danger, that product, and graph that product, it tracks exactly with engagement and with tension in a story for target audiences.
Wow. Okay.
And the cool news is, at any moment, even improvisationally in a presentation, if you think you're starting to lose the audience, all you have to do is remind them of what could go wrong, what's at risk here, and how likely it is that something could go wrong.
That's a very interesting one.
Those elements are always there. I mean, think of creating a vaccine for coronavirus.
Yeah.
Well, the risk of coming in second in that race is incredible, because if you come in second, no one's going to buy your vaccine. They're not going to buy somebody else's vaccine, right?
Yeah.
And the likelihood that a vaccine in trials succeeds isn't that great. So there's great risk. There's incredible tension because you have to try to not only make yours work, but make it work first. If you were doing the story of the process, and you're telling people about 50 million beakers that are sitting in a lab somewhere, and you're dapping little bits of reagent into those different labs and seeing what happens, and you're bringing in 1,000 people and shooting them in the arm and then watching them for a month, and it all sounds very technical and very boring, and you're starting to lose the audience, and you go back and talk about how dangerous it is, and yet what's the reward? So what's the goal? What are the risks and the dangers? And all of a sudden they're back. The audience is back. These are incredibly powerful tools, risk and danger, that are at your disposal every moment of a thing that you produce, of a talk that you're giving, to hold the audience in your hands. And most people never stop to think about it. So problems and conflicts create risk and danger.
Yeah.
And then we want to know, and notice we haven't talked about events in the story yet, or plot at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stories are not plot driven. Plot exists to explain character.
Yeah.
That's why you have a plot. So finally we get to where the plot comes in, and that is to say, we want to know how does the character struggle?
Okay.
That is to say, what are they going to do to try to overcome problems and conflicts, facing risk and danger, to get to a goal that's important to them?
Yeah.
So that's number 7. Number 8 then are the details. What do we mean by details? Well, the only way you've gotten information about the world for all your life is by using your sensory organs.
Yeah.
Eyes, ears, touch, the five senses.
Five, yeah.
Right? Your brain is set to use that information. It knows exactly how to create mental imagery from it, store that into memory, and pull it back out of memory.
Yeah.
Details are the written or spoken version of the sensory information that you would get on your own if you were there, wherever there is in the story.
Yeah.
So when we talk about details, what are we talking about? What does it look like, feel like, sound like, smell like? If you were there, what would your senses be telling you?
Yeah.
If you provide that information, every human being, the brain of every human being knows exactly what to do with that information to create vivid mental imagery that then goes into memory in such a way so that they're able to dredge it back out of memory again. Most things, by the way, that go into your memory never come back out.
Yeah.
So the question is, there's a direct correlation between in the research. This really isn't mine. Other people have done this research. There's a direct correlation between the density of sensory detail for a memory when it goes into memory, for an image when it goes into memory, and the likelihood that you'll be able to ever pull it back out of memory, and that when you pull it back out, it'll come out accurately. It won't be significantly changed or altered. So the more detail you can provide when you do your stories, the more the information associated with those images will go into people's memory in such a way so that they'll accurately be able to recall it at some time in the future when that information could affect their decisions, could affect their behavior.
Yeah. That by itself, we can stop here, and that by itself will be crazy. However, I think that in order for us to kind of, let's say that in order for us to kind of complete the picture, you started at the beginning with the fact that if we don't cover those elements, our brain is wired to search for those elements. And when we consume something through our visual sense, let's say, it first goes to our unconscious and it applies. In the book, you called it a story structure, right? And in this process, it searches for those elements. Like, can you just and you also mentioned here a few moments ago that when those type of things are missing, those elements are missing, people on the other end, potentially in the context of this podcast, our audiences may get the story in a different way than they are supposed to. Mm-hmm. So it is obviously very critical for us to try and incorporate information for all of those elements. Otherwise, we are risking the effectiveness, and maybe that's why you said effective story. Yeah. So, like, what's happening behind the scenes? Like,
okay, let me give you an example, a real simple example.
Yeah.
Person number one says, "Where's John?" Person number two says, "Well, I didn't want to say anything, but I saw a green VW parked in front of Carol's." Again, person number one, "Where's John?" Person number two, "Well, I didn't want to say anything, but I saw a green VW parked in front of Carol's." Now, the question is, if you given those two lines, what's going on here, and what's the relationship between the four humans who are mentioned? Person number one who speaks, person number two who speaks, someone named John who's spoken about, and someone named Carol who's spoken about.
Mm.
The odds are, and this is just from the number of times I've tested with lines like that line or others like it, 98 out of 100 people, as soon as they heard it, would have been able to say what the relationship, who person number one probably is, who person number two probably is, the relationship between John and Carol. Why? Because in order to make sense out of it, and you assumed that it would have to make sense because someone just gave it to you. In order to make sense out of it, you had to fill in a number of blanks. Yeah. Let's look at and you do that automatically without consciously knowing it. Okay. First, you probably didn't stop and think about it, but you took one of the lines from person number two, and in order to make it make sense, completely flipped the meaning.
Okay.
They said, person number two said, well, I didn't want to say anything, but, and you probably flipped it in your mind to mean it in effect, oh boy, this is the best gossip I've had in weeks. Can't wait to blurt this one out.
Okay.
Second, person number two was asked about a person, John, and talks about a car.
Yeah.
There is no relationship between the two.
But you infer
Except
it.
in order to make sense out of it, every person who's ever heard that assumes that John and a green VW have to be linked.
Yeah, and it's his car.
But it doesn't say that. You
That's
assumed
true.
it.
Yeah.
You also assumed, because it wouldn't make sense otherwise, that person number one, person number two are physically co-located.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
But it
that's
doesn't
true.
actually say that. We all know that intelligence groups like the CIA and all those kind of people, they're monitoring worldwide communications. And this could just be two sequential lines on their daily feed. And person number one could have been in Berlin, and person number two could have been in Taiwan. And they have absolutely no relationship to each other. But you didn't give yourself a chance to even consider that possibility, because you had to make it make sense.
Yeah.
And so you assumed John has a green VW and went to Carol's, but probably shouldn't have gone to Carol's because person number one won't like hearing that John went to Carol. You assume character, goal, motive. You assumed all of those elements in order to make it make sense.
Yeah.
And you do it automatically. And once you've done it, you don't stop and say, well, I made up these assumptions. I should test those assumptions.
Yeah.
You just say,
that's
oh,
true.
that's what it means, and go with it. So
Exactly. Yeah.
when a company is trying to communicate, the people listening won't say, excuse me, there's some of those elements missing. Could you fill those in, please? No, they'll infer them on their own and assume, without ever stopping to think about it, that what they're thinking is exactly what was really meant, even though in many cases it isn't.
It's not. Yeah.
And that's why these elements are so worthwhile to consider. It's because without them, the probability that people will misinterpret your communication skyrockets.
Yeah, that is when I read very similar example in in Storyproof, and then I watched another interview with you somewhere on another podcast or something. You gave a similar example, and I again paused and I was like, wait, so I already drew those conclusions, and I really think I got the picture right. And then I unpaused, and then you said, maybe you inferred this and this and this and this, but I didn't say it. So why is that happening? And I was like, pause again. And I was like, wow, that is very interesting. And then when you apply it in the context of the presentations and you miss that information, here you have the problem. Many people don't include those elements. And then the audience understands a completely different message.
Or the other option the audience has is to tune out.
Yeah,
and
when
they
it's
always
very
have that option is to lose engagement.
When do they tune out? When do they tune out?
A good question. Usually there are a number of things that make them tune out.
Okay.
Some have to do with the material. A lot have to do with the presentation of it.
Okay.
Vocal characteristics, vocal patterns, the physical presence of the person who's doing the presentation.
Okay.
Whether they think, of course, anytime a presenter actually tries to read their presentation, that's a cue to, I'll just get the transcripts from the conference and I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And mentally, most of the audience is then gone. What was I gonna? There was another point there that I was going to make it now.
I think that I also I think that also somewhere in the book you also mentioned that when the presenter, when you said the vocal part right now, I connected to what you said in the book, that and I can relate to that so badly, and I believe everyone in the audience can relate to this, is that when the presenter speaks or presents the information in a way that the audience does not understand and it gets so complicated, because we cannot make sense of that complicated information, it's now way too much effort for our brain. And at some point, our brain just says, enough.
Cognitive overload.
Yeah.
As it turns out, if you write, you flip it around. When you read something that someone wrote, an article, an essay, a story, you are in full control of your experience of that material. Okay. You want to read slower, you read slower. You want to read faster, you read faster. You want to skim for a couple of paragraphs, you skim. You want to stop and go into the kitchen, get something to drink, and come back and sit, squirm in your chair and mull stuff over for a minute, you do. So a writer can be a little less straightforward because they know that the reader is in full control of their experience of receiving the information. Not so in a presentation. A storyteller, a presenter, is in full and complete control of the audience's experience. If they need to have something repeated, tough luck to them unless the presenter repeats it. If they need more detail, they're out of luck unless the presenter decides to include more detail, which means that a live presenter has a much greater responsibility to the audience to make sure that they don't get lost than a writer does. And often when we're doing presentations, we write it down as if, and look at it as if it were going to be read by the audience, and then stand up to present it, and the audience gets lost because presenters need to use shorter, simpler sentences. They need to use greater use of repetition. They need to put in a lot more guideposts, signposts along the way, little reminders where we've been, where we are, where we're going, so that the audience can place themselves within the context of the whole piece. When you're reading, you know how many pages this thing is, and if you're on page 3 of 12 pages, you sort of have some expectations for what you're going to find on page 3, just because of where it is within that whole body of information. And in a presentation, you don't have a clue. So the presenter has to provide those things. So it's much more common for people to lose engagement, say, wait a minute, I'm confused, I don't know where we are anymore, in a live presentation, and then tune out. Then when they're reading. So presenters have this incredible responsibility to always be monitoring the audience and make sure that the audience gets what they need in order to understand the presentation. Even if it means they've got to do a little improvising, backtracking, repeating, stopping, saying, did you get that part? Did you get that part? That was important. Let's go over it again. Whatever you have to do to make sure, because the only thing that matters is what gets into the conscious mind and memory of your audience. Nothing else matters. That's where the story happens. So you, the presenter, have to do whatever you have to do to make sure that your material actually gets there. It doesn't matter if you say it all came out my mouth. It was all on the slides. That doesn't matter unless it also gets into the conscious mind and memory of your audience. And that's a very different question, because that's where the story science and the story elements come in, is making sure that your information actually gets into your target, which is conscious mind and memory of your audience.
Okay, let's end up with this. Where and what, because I would say everything, so that's why probably you navigate me better. Where can people find more about that thing, except for obviously April, when we are going to be at the conference, at the virtual conference we are organizing? Where should people find more about story, the elements, and everything that you produced, and all of your work?
First off, they call you and talk to 356 Lab, and website, www.kendallhaven.com.
Easy.
And the two books that cover this, what we've talked about and
Yeah.
more. First is, you mentioned it, Story Proof. There's
Yes.
a long subtitle, but Story Proof is enough to
Yes.
get there. The follow-on to that is Story Smart.
Yeah.
And so the Story Smart talks more about the experiments that done in the lab and what that meant, and actually what may well come out as the third book in the series, which will be the Story Effect.
Hopefully
Got a name
so.
for it. Is now it's now the research is done. Thing is there. I haven't started writing yet, and I haven't decided if that's really how it should come out now. But those two books, Story Smart, Story Proof, are the two that, for my work, that really sum up all that we've talked about today.
Yeah, I would say that when I got Story Proof, a lot of my friends actually already got it. So when I got Story Proof, I was a little bit surprised by the size of it. I was like, that looks like a book from a school. Like, it's not that thick. I expected it's going to be like really thick. And I was like, that's interesting. And then I started reading it and I realized on the first pages, that will be probably one of the most interesting books ever. And every single time when somebody buys it or decides to buy it, I always warn them, don't get confused by the size of the book, because you may end up being pleasantly surprised by what's in that small form factor, if you wish. Because again, I cannot, like, from our experience, I cannot just say how much that book is really worth of reading, and not only by, I would say, presentation people, but by people who care about communication, right?
That's really what it's about. It turns out that the elements of story structure control communication between
Yeah.
people, because
Yeah.
it stands between the outside world and the conscious mind. Everything that gets to your conscious mind filters through these story elements and the story structure. So to get your thoughts, I don't care how you're getting them across to someone, presentation, article, video,
Yeah.
anything gets into the conscious mind in story form. The more you're aware of it, the more effective your communications will be,
Yeah.
however you get them across.
Yeah. And at the conference and at the workshop, you also promised that you are going to mention some new things that are not
Oh
part
yeah,
of those books. So
absolutely. I guarantee we'll get into some things that will just blow your mind,
yeah.
from when we can show how things couple together, and how they work, and how simple it is. Want one more quick example?
Yeah. Let's go.
One more. The topic. You probably have heard things like, you only get one chance to make a good first impression.
Yes.
Those
Yeah.
sorts of lines. Well, it turns out that when I've started to test that sort of a thing,
Okay.
given the first sentence of a story,
Okay.
first sentence of a talk, almost every person I have ever tested was able, having heard just that one sentence, to say
Okay.
who they thought this was going to be about, what they thought it was going to be about, and how they wanted it to end, and how they thought it was probably going to end.
Wow.
And more importantly, often that information isn't in the first sentence, right?
Yeah.
But more importantly, once they created that version in their mind of the structure of this piece, they were very reticent to ever change, and in fact resisted changing, and got angry both at me and at the story when it became obvious that actually that first structure that they had in their minds was wrong. They started to lose engagement, which means that the idea of slowly rolling into especially in a presentation, especially
Yeah.
in a fairly short article, of kind of rolling into your information, giving a little background information, is deadly. You want to jump straight into grab people and shake them up a little bit on the right at the get-go and let them know where they're going, and that where you want to take them is important to them.
Yeah.
Do that, and then you have then you have both their attention, that they're engaged, and you also then have the option to fill in and build that presentation. But if you get them off on thinking the wrong way at the opening,
Beginning,
the odds are you've lost them forever.
wow, that also makes
so
sense.
We'll talk about those elements. We'll talk about what exactly are the pieces of information that audiences use to figure out who it's about, what it's about, where it's going, how I want it to, where I want it to end, and how to use those expectations to your own purposes as you build and put in some foreshadowing in a talk.
Yeah. I also, by the way, that is completely honest now, and I'll end up with this. I also will be first of all, I will be moderating the workshop. That is guaranteed. And the reason is completely selfish. As you can imagine, it's completely selfish because I want to get involved in that workshop, and that kind of not only to help with the questions of the audience of those 15 people that will be in, but just for myself to kind of check up like my understanding on some things, and for sure learn those things that you just mentioned, because I personally haven't heard about them since now. So that will be for sure something interesting to listen to, and kind of again rethink in our communication what we do and how we do it, etc. So let's end up here, because there is just so much. I believe that someone who is going to listen to this needs to listen to it a few times for sure. I really want to end it now, and everything else will come up again in the books, at the event. Find Kendall Haven.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And read, consume absolutely everything. So I cannot thank you enough for spending this 1 hour here.
Oh, thank you. It was a delight, and I'm looking forward to both the April and to our next conversation.
Absolutely. So for everyone else, you know where to find the information, you know where to find the books. It's very, very simple. And if you want to know more about the event, it's called Present to Succeed. So you can check it out at presenttosucceed.com. And if you want to find more about our company, it's not 365 Labs, as many people think, 356 Labs. So thank you very much for listening to this one, and see you in the next one.